Hello and thank you for listening. My name is Bryan Harnett, host of the Plant Podcast. The Plant is brought to you by ThinManager Software, the global leader in thin client management and mobility solutions. ACP ThinManager was acquired by Rockwell Automation in September of 2016. In this episode of The Plant, I had a chance to talk with Doug Coulter, product manager for Rockwell Automation, and ask a few questions about the next release of the ThinManager platform, version 10. Hello and welcome to The Plant. Joining me today is Doug Coulter, product manager for Rockwell Automation. Hey Doug, how you doing?
I'm awesome, Bryan. Thanks for asking.
Oh, no problem. Well, thanks so much for joining us today. Today we're going to talk a little bit about ThinManager version 10, which is scheduled for release this month in December. Before we get into some of the new features of version 10 of ThinManager, can you tell us a little bit about how you became involved in the ThinManager product?
Yeah, absolutely. So many of the listeners may have heard me tell this story, but I was a systems integrator for a number of years, based out of Baltimore, Maryland. So basically 15, 16 years of my professional life were spent as a control systems integrator. And during those early years, I was fortunate enough to be exposed to ThinManager on a couple of different projects. And we had such great success with it. Our customers were continually asking us to come back to deploy it in other areas of their plant, that it really became the default platform for us. We really looked at it as a differentiator between us and our competition, really allowed us to offer more value to our customers. Then in 2014, I joined ACP, where I basically focused on the Rockwell Automation distribution channel. And then after Rockwell acquired us in September of 2016, I became ThinManager product manager.
So you just kind of eased into it, if you will, and it was cool that you were already focusing on the Rockwell channel, being with the acquisition that happened last year.
Yeah, I think from a transition standpoint, in both cases, joining ACP initially was a very smooth transition for me. I had existing relationships with a lot of the people in the ACP office, and again, I was promoting ThinManager, for a number of years. I think internally within the integration company that I worked for, they were getting tired of me, promoting it continuously. And then, of course, transitioning into Rockwell Automation, yeah, it was also a smooth transition. Really hadn't thought about it that way, but yeah, absolutely. I'd been working with a lot of the distribution channel previously, and certainly I had gotten to know a number of the folks at Rockwell Automation over the years too.
Cool. Yeah, I remember you being kind of a platinum integrator, a real spokesperson for ThinManager even before you were on board.
Yep, absolutely.
Let's talk a little bit about version 10. It's coming for release in the next couple of weeks. With all of our releases, obviously, there's new features worth talking about. And before we get specific, I did want to know how does the management team decide what features to try to build into a new release?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think historically you'll see that the feature set that has evolved in ThinManager has primarily been driven by our customers. I think that's probably pretty typical of most products. I think what's unique, historically, again, from an ACP standpoint and now Rockwell Automation standpoint, is that we'll take a feature request from a customer and really evolve it into something more. I think two great examples of that would be really what has become relevance, our mobility, the foundation of our mobility strategy, as well as virtual screens. Both of these kind of started as smaller feature requests from customers. For relevance, for example, that really started with a customer requesting support for QR codes. And of course, our product management and development teams get together and say, well, wait, let's see what more we can do with this. And that really started the whole concept of location-based content delivery for us. And then virtual screens was kind of similar in that, we had an end user who wanted to kind of get that picture-in-picture experience, out at a thin client that they're managing with ThinManager. And we had supported overlays for IP cameras for a number of years where you could overlay a camera on top of an existing piece of content. But what this customer wanted was that overlay to be something more like another remote desktop server session, as an example. And that really is what spawned the whole concept of virtual screens, which allows an end user to create a layout of any sort for their content, allowing them to really bring together a lot of disparate sources and lay that content out in a very specific way.
That's cool. So, I mean, basically, these new features come from the end users, and there's probably many users who didn't know they could use it or know they even wanted it until another user brought it forth and it became an actual rolled out feature.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I think when we take these feature requests, which as you can imagine, we get quite a few of them throughout the year, and years for that matter. And the ones that continually come up are the ones that we tend to focus on a bit. And then, if it seems a lot like this is more of a one-off type of feature request where it's really going to serve the purposes of just that particular end user, we may be able to find more value in it by just expanding upon it a little bit more. I think beyond the customer feedback, we're also looking at ways to really fundamentally improve the product, right? Through infrastructure, security enhancements. May not always be promoted as much at release time, but an example of that are some few late additions that we're throwing into 10.0, providing enhanced support for multiple domains as an example, performance enhancements in our session scaling capability. Previously, with a real-time streaming protocol camera, if you had an HD graphics chipset, you could offload that to the graphics processing unit, the GPU of the thin client, really freeing up the thin client CPU. We're looking at doing the same thing for the session scaling that we're doing that really helps facilitate the whole virtual screening capability as well as tiling. So our development team has been looking at ways of offloading that to the GPU as well, and that'll be included in the product. So really, the release we tend to highlight those real customer centric features, typically speaking. But there's generally speaking a lot of fundamental stuff that goes into a release as well that we like to build in. So it really becomes more of a balance.
Sure, keeps making the product stronger and more
That's right.
nimble, if you will. So, okay, for those that don't know a whole lot about ThinManager, I haven't looked a lot at our marketing stuff. I mean, we typically talk about ThinManager in feature sets, kind of in buckets, and we
I love those
eh,
buckets.
yeah, well, we categorize them into really like four buckets: productivity, visualization, security, and mobility, which doesn't encompass all of ThinManager, but makes it easier to focus on. This will enhance security per se. Is this release of 10? Is there one maybe more than the other that it seems to enhance?
I think if you had to look at the feature set in 10, I think it would fall probably in two of those categories, mostly security and productivity. And I think that you'll see that a number of the features that we'll talk about touch both of those buckets. And I guess that could be expected because those are probably the two most valued themes to our customers, and those are the things that tend to come up more and more. And that's ultimately what, again, as we just mentioned in the previous discussion, would ultimately drive some of these key features.
Yeah, I could see that, especially, I mean, those two categories, especially with today, security is huge. Okay, so let me ask you kind of a tough question because it probably depends on the end user and what they use ThinManager for. But is there a particular feature you think will make the most impact, or I guess give us, if not your favorite, the one that you think people are really going to gravitate to with the new release?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's actually easier this time around, mostly because this particular feature has been requested of me in particular, probably for 5, 6 years, and it was a regular occurrence. It's something that we're calling authentication pass through, and now that we are Rockwell Automation, we're able to accomplish some of these things when we combine Rockwell products, like say FactoryTalk View SE with ThinManager. So the whole concept of authentication pass-through is you log in to a ThinManager managed terminal using a relevance user in ThinManager. And that terminal may already have some sessions being delivered to it, maybe in this case, some FactoryTalk View SE sessions. And ultimately, what our end users were really requiring or requesting was that login, that relevance user login that occurs at the ThinManager level, affects those sessions that are running a FactoryTalk View SE on that given terminal. And that's what authentication pass-through is. Basically, that login that occurs at the ThinManager level using a relevance user, and maybe that's a badge, maybe a fingerprint scan as an example, that creates a security token that we can then pass into those FactoryTalk View SE sessions. So take a control room as an example where you might have one operator who's monitoring a number of FactoryTalk View SE instances, maybe spanned across multiple displays using tiling, virtual screens, etc. Today, for that user to log into those multiple sessions, they would have to go to each one of those sessions and manually log in. And imagine if you have 12, 16 instances of that, that becomes quite taxing. So with authentication pass-through, that becomes really a single login, at the ThinManager level, again, badge, fingerprint scan as an example. and then those sessions that are being delivered to that terminal would automatically pick up that security token and log that user in. So that's probably by far and away the single biggest feature in 10.0, and it's mostly because of the demand that we've had over the years for it.
I could see that. Yeah, that's not one that you can say a marketing or advertising standpoint. It probably doesn't have the biggest bells and whistles, but from an actual productivity standpoint,
Yeah.
users are gonna just freak about it. Just make their life a lot easier.
Well, and I think a lot of times users, new users to ThinManager probably think that that's the way it's going to work anyway, right? With regard to the content that you're delivering and ThinManager, the ThinManager login process. Ultimately, that relevance user capability, way back when it was first introduced as term secure, the primary existence for that was to deliver additional content to that ThinManager managed terminal based on that user's identity, not to in any way affect the content that was already being delivered to the terminal. In general, ThinManager doesn't know a whole lot about the content that's being delivered to the terminal outside of telling the terminal where it gets it from, right? This authentication pass-through does provide a little more intelligence, specifically regarding FactoryTalk View SE sessions.
Before I let you go, I really just wanted you to talk about features coming to ThinManager 10 that the end users and our listeners can get a little bit excited about.
Yeah, absolutely. So with 10.0, we're going to be releasing a new version of WinTMC. So that's our Windows-based ThinManager client that you can install, obviously, in a Windows operating system. It's going to be adding support for virtual screens, tiling, and IP cameras. That really makes WinTMC the very first of our mobile clients to support these features. So if you were at Automation Fair this year, you would have seen a fairly large screen in the integrated architecture section of the exhibit floor, where we were doing a 4x4 tile of 16 independent Panel View Plus and Panel View 5000 VNC sessions that were coming from these visualization trees, what are called the Viz trees, that were also right next to us, adjacent to our where the ThinManager area was. So basically take that concept, that tiling concept, and apply it to, say, a Surface Pro now. So now you can basically take this Surface Pro or any other Microsoft mobile device, and you get that capability, that tiling, virtual screens, and even IP camera capability right on that mobile device. So really take the concept of a control room, and now you're making it mobile. And that's going to be really applicable to these plants that are asking more of their operators. The operators having to manage and monitor multiple process lines at the same time. This is really going to facilitate that for them, right? So we're really excited about that. Of course, our other mobile clients, ITMC for the iOS and ATMC for Android, those will follow suit in the upcoming months as well. But for 10.0, that WinTMC will be the first one to add that support. We're also doing password caching in 10.0. So what that ultimately means is that you can configure a period of time for which a relevance user in ThinManager doesn't have to re-enter their password. So maybe you configure that for the time of your shift, for an 8-hour shift as an example. And an operator logs in at their first terminal in the morning. Maybe they're using a badge plus a password to do so. They won't be asked for that password again for the remainder of their shift. So they can go into other terminals, just simply badge in. So again, we're talking about those productivity and security buckets there. So I think that's going to be a big one for us. Similarly, we're adding support for PIN authentication. Right? We've all had that experience now with our mobile devices where we're not entering passwords anymore. We're simply adding a PIN to log in. And that's what we're really looking to do again here with this support for pins in the relevance user side of the fence. And Automation Fair, the other thing that we demonstrated, which got a lot of excitement over, was this new ThinManager client for the Microsoft HoloLens. So that was demonstrated, very cool, demonstrated in the innovation zone. And essentially it allowed us to deliver the ThinManager content that we've all become familiar and fell in love with over these years. We can now deliver that to an augmented reality device like the HoloLens. So what we were seeing there in the innovation zone is a user wearing the HoloLens looking right at a piece of equipment that they're monitoring, and really superimposed for them in the HoloLens is the HMI, the Factory Talk View SE implementation of that line, and they can use hand gestures, et cetera, to control that process. So that was a pretty big one, and that ThinManager client called UTMC also has support for QR codes and Bluetooth beacons today. So that's pretty exciting. So we can deliver that location-based content to the HoloLens as well.
That's pretty cool. So if you have like a maintenance guy who walks up to a motor that's acting weird, and with the HoloLens, they could look at the manual, the schematics, all that kind of stuff right there at the motor and still have their hands free.
Exactly. Yeah, that's exactly right. And those are the types of things that we were demonstrating in that innovation zone booth. I think the last thing that I'll leave you with regard to 10.0, we're now looking at the mobile devices, say your smartphone as an example, to act as a beacon for us. So what does that mean? Well, there are many different ways that we can enable logins at a ThinManager managed terminal. We mentioned badging, we mentioned fingerprint scanning. Well, I think we all know that ThinManager also supports Bluetooth beacons for location resolution to detect where a mobile device is. Well, then what we can do in 10.0 specifically for iOS devices is we can detect when that particular mobile device is close to another ThinManager managed terminal, say a tethered Thin client, and we can associate that particular mobile device with a user, so that's what ultimately logs that user in at that terminal. So maybe they're not using a badge, they're not using a fingerprint scan. Basically, it's just the presence, the proximity of their mobile device that's generally on their person. That's what actually gets them logged into that device.
All right. Well, I mean, those are all fantastic features. And I guess, correct me if I'm wrong, ThinManager version 10 is supposed to come out in roughly 2 to 3 weeks, right? It should come out before the holidays.
Yeah, that's right. December 18th is our slated date. We originally had it slated for December 4th. We incorporated a late request from a customer of ours, somewhat of an obscure request, that I don't know if a lot of end users will get to take advantage of, but it has something to do with our ActiveX control. We support something called custom variables in ThinManager, and this request was the ability to write to one of those custom variables through the ActiveX control. So again, taking this customer feedback in, kind of the theme of this podcast, right, and incorporating it into the releases. Now we can't obviously always delay releases to incorporate customer feature requests, right? But in certain situations, when it's possible and we can really help a customer and possibly a larger deployment, we're certainly going to look to do that.
That's awesome. All right. Well, that's all the time we have for this episode of The Plant. I want to give special thanks to you, Doug, for joining us from Rockwell Automation.
Thanks, Bryan.
As always, if anybody wants further information on ThinManager and Thin Client Management, go to ThinManager.com. We have all sorts of resources you can take a look at to learn probably more than you ever wanted to know about ThinManager and Thin Client Management. Doug, thanks again, and everybody have a nice day. We'll see you on the next episode.